Welcome to Software Snack Bites. I'm Shomik Ghosh of Bold Start Ventures, and today we're excited to have Ryan Denehy on the pod. Ryan is the founder and CEO of Electric AI, which provides IT management software and solutions for SMBs. And he's also a three-time founder with two exits at previous startups that he's built, starting from actually his time all the way back in college. So in this episode, we're going to cover just frankly a bunch of founder learnings, scaling an SMB mid-market kind of go-to-market, hiring tips and managing people, and then hopefully, also cover a little bit about AI as well. So, Ryan, just to kick things off, I guess maybe start from like your childhood and like growing up and stuff like that. Like, how'd you get into starting a company in college and then, of course, end up at Electric AI?
Yeah, probably I had a healthy disdain for almost anything that was the standard way of doing things. Like I was not a good student. I didn't like team sports. I hated the idea of just like having to go get a normal job. So, pretty much like both unemployable and largely unmanageable as a human from a young age. I mean, there were times where like I would skip soccer practice and just like go to the skate park because I wanted to skateboard. I didn't want to like play on a soccer team, but it was good. I mean, that basically, I just was fiercely passionate about not doing things the way that anyone else did them, which maybe isn't the best reason to go start a company, but it definitely gave me the motivation to go out and do it. And so because I was really into extreme sports and I was into filming and photography, my first business was I was making mountain biking DVDs of all things. And
so like, and one mixtape for mountain biking.
That's exactly what it was. Yeah. And you can actually still find some of the videos on YouTube, but it was just classic kind of like DIY entrepreneurship. When you're 16, 17 years old, you don't know anything. You don't realize how ludicrous your ideas are and how naive you're being. And so like one story I like to tell is, I needed sponsors for the movie because I couldn't afford to buy myself plane tickets and fly around the world and go to all these events and all this stuff. And so I went to Barnes and Noble. I bought a couple different mountain biking magazines and I ripped out all of the full page ads. And so I sent sponsorship proposals and a little DVD demo reel to every company that was running a full page ad in Mountain Bike Magazine. Because my thought was like, well, if they're running advertising, they have like a marketing budget. And so I probably sent out 60 or 70 of those and then just cold called, every single person that would just ask for the marketing manager. And so I ended up landing like a half a dozen sponsors through that. And then I had a distribution deal, which fell through at the 11th hour, which sucked because I told all my sponsors that I had distribution. And, my backup plan, actually, if I wasn't able to find a new distributor, I had actually set up desks and a phone system in my garage at my parents' house. And so my friends and I, the plan was that we were going to cold call every bike shop in North America, and I was going to replicate the DVDs myself. Thankfully, that didn't happen. One of my sponsors had their own distribution facility out in Utah, and they had a couple interns from BYU come in and just hammer the phones one summer, and we sold 4,000 copies of the movie. So it all works out. But
wow,
very good lesson in just the value of like distribution and also just knowing that whenever you think you got it all figured out, just wait for the next shoe to drop. Like it's always good until it isn't.
So, that company ended up getting acquired. Like how'd that happen?
So the guy that ended up sort of we ended up being co-founders for two companies, Rudd Davis, he was out in California. I was still in college running the film production business. He was out in California. He had graduated from college. He had raised a little bit of money to build a destination website where you could buy extreme sports videos online. You could buy digital downloads of extreme sports videos, and sounded like a great idea. The thing is no one had a broadband connection. A lot of people didn't have a broadband internet connection in 2006, 2007. And even if you did, you had a desktop in your like computer room at your house. Like you didn't have a laptop. You didn't have so no one wanted to buy extreme sports videos on their desktop computer, right? Like this was not a problem that anyone was seeking a solution for. Anyways, he reaches out to me. One thing leads to another, and we basically decide to go into go into business together, I just was so interested in where things were going with technology. And I was frankly just starting to get kind of bored being a filmmaker. I realized I enjoyed the marketing and distribution of the content business much more than I liked the production of the content. So it worked out really well. And so we set out to build this company. And yeah, classic, just like, made sense on paper, right? It's like, hey, millions of these DVDs get sold every year. The younger generation, they all have internet connections, like sell them online. You actually talk to people and they're like, why would I do that? I can just go to the store and buy a DVD and watch it on my TV. Like, this makes no sense. But we were too naive to understand that what we were missing was this thing called product market fit. And so I think we just thought that if we lied to ourselves enough, it would eventually come true. Turns out that's a horrible strategy. I think of like the $1 million that we raised. I think in the end, we probably spent 600,000 or 700,000 on this website that no one cared about. So kind of in the 11th hour, he like sat me down in his office one day and he's like, we're going to be out of business in a few months, but I think we have a better business. We're going to start an ad network. So we know all these websites that produce all this content that we've been talking to license it, blah, 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 blah. Like, this is the way to go do it. So we pivoted, but literally while we were just right about to run out of money, pivoted the business to being an ad network. And that business, I mean, we were booking more revenue in the first 30 days after we pivoted to being an ad network than we had in the previous 2 years. And then we got super lucky. We brought in a CEO from the outside, a guy named Ross Shuffleberger, who had been the GM of AOL Sports. And he came in, he knew some corp dev people at Gannett, which was the parent company of USA Today. They were looking for a new digital strategy. And we successfully sold the business on New Year's Day, 2008. So it was a good one.
Wow. Literally, I mean, just what a story. Pivot, timing, just everything. But one question that came up, and obviously, like I say this, tongue in cheek, obviously Electric AI has been a great success. And so, but like you were doing, ad tech quite, early on, right? And given some of the success that you've seen in that space, like, do you ever wonder, like, if you had started an ad tech company like right away, would you have ridden that wave to something new?
Unless the company I started was called The Trade Desk, I don't know that I would have made any money in ad tech, right? Like, it's tough because the ad tech space circa 2012, when we were leaving USA Today, there were so many companies that were growing so fast. And it's one of those industries where, particularly at the time, it was kind of the Wild West. The revenue was very easy come, easy go. You could get a few people in a room and be doing millions of dollars in revenue overnight by standing up an ad network or a DSP or whatever. But I think what Rudd and I looked at was just the fact that it was kind of a race to the bottom. We sort of felt like, okay, we could go start an ad tech company and be one of 500 businesses that is effectively making money via arbitrage. And so we had some people around us who were much, much smarter than we were, who were telling us this. And we didn't come up with this on our own, but like we had a lot of people in the media business who were much more experienced, who were like, look, at the end of the day, like the vast majority of these companies are going to go to zero. If you want to start it as a lifestyle business, like great, but like this is probably not the path to building a really big enduring company. And I think he and I had just kind of gotten a little fed up with that space anyways. Like we sort of were like, yeah, we're just going to like go sell squares and rectangles on web pages for another 5 years. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, we still have a lot of, really, really good relationships in that industry, but like, no, we just decided that we had a couple ideas for software companies, which was great. It was just a very rude awakening. Generating $1 million through an ad tech business, you can do in a couple of emails. Generating $1 million in revenue selling SaaS to SMBs is a very different story.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit. And actually, so the company you ended up starting after that was called Swarm, and Swarm was actually acquired by Groupon. And I think some of the listeners may not know, like Groupon at the time was like the coolest, fastest, that was like a early Google sort of thing, right? It was just amazing talent. And so like, I guess, what was it like working there at the time post Swarm? Like, was it just all like crazy, growth, scale, like just craziness, or was there actually some semblance of cohesion and talent and stuff?
Yeah, so we got there late 2014, and it was an interesting time because this was sort of on the downslope of the hypergrowth that they had gone through.
Okay.
So Groupon end of 2014 was doing, I think, a couple billion in revenue at least, multi-billion-dollar market cap business. I think 12,000 employees worldwide, operating in, I think, roughly 45 countries. So this was a serious operation, but it was a little bit past its prime at that point. Like the true hypergrowth had slowed down. They had expanded into a bunch of different business lines beyond just the daily deals. There was a product called Groupon Goods. Swarm, we got subsumed into a division called Merchant OS, which was all SMB facing SaaS and payments technology, which was super interesting. And so, yeah, when we got in there, I would say the coolest thing was just, being part of a company that is doing billions in revenue with over 10,000 employees operating all around the world, particularly after grinding it out with a 25 employee startup for several years. Like it felt really good to be kind of back in a public company that had the scale and the name brand and some really incredible talent there. That being said, it was a complicated time for the company because there were just a lot of aspects of the business that weren't working. And obviously, if you look at how the company is performing today, you'll see sort of the evidence of that. But for me, the biggest takeaway, this is just my opinion. I'm sure other people who work there might feel differently, but it felt to us that the company was run on a lot of vanity metrics while kind of ignoring some existential problems. So, for example, first day that we got there after the acquisition, I think 3 different people told us like, "Hey, Groupon, we have 100 million app downloads." They're like, "Great, wow, it's a lot of people. That's a third of the U.S. population." But then you would have other people at the company who would go, "Yeah, but the vast majority have never logged in, or they bought a Groupon deal, they've never redeemed it, and if they don't redeem it, they don't buy another one." And so you start to look at stuff like that, and you're like, "Well, wait a second, like we're going to run out of internet connected humans on Earth in like the next year." And so then I think it became hard to retain some of the senior staff because people look at it and go like, "Hey, we have this like breakage problem that's like existential to the business. Like we're not actually allocating like appropriate resources to go solve it." And that's like one example. But yeah, so that was super eye-opening. Also too, just because the company grew so fast, to me, it felt like the business of Groupon at the time was managing itself rather than developing innovative products for customers, right? So it's like when one of your strategic priorities is like, we're going to get everybody onto the same database. It's like, that's cool. That's very important. But when like most of your SMB customers lose money working with you, hey, we should probably solve that too.
Right.
Again, like actually, like despite the woes with sort of like the strategy and the challenges the company had, like I had an awesome time working there. I met a lot of amazing people. And it certainly wasn't for lack of effort, but yeah, a lot of lessons learned coming out of there for sure.
So I guess let's get to the Electric AI story. Like, what made you decide to start Electric AI, and also, you clearly made the decision to start in the SMB segment. So, like, you had the experience from Swarm, you had the experience from Groupon as well in that sort of market. But just talk a little bit about starting Electric AI.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, if you're not familiar, Electric, we make IT management software and solutions for companies that don't have any in-house IT staff. So basically, it's companies that are anywhere from 5 to 50 or 5 to 100 full-time employees. We make all of that stuff really easy, managing your devices and SaaS and security. Great business. It's a really awesome space. It's a corner of the market that's really ignored by the vast majority of people building IT solutions, but it's somewhat embarrassing for me to say that Electric was the first company I started where I actually felt the pain as the customer. And so if I rewind the clock, I started Electric at the end of 2016, but the idea initially came to me in 2013 in San Francisco. We had just closed the Series A for Swarm. We were, 10 employees, but we had just hired another like 14 people, just moved in a new office. And I'm in the office on a Saturday trying to figure out how to set up our Wi-Fi network. Yeah, and I have a photo on my Instagram from back then, from 2013. It's just like I'm sitting there in this empty office with like Cat 5 cables and like Meraki access points, just like, scattered everywhere. And, our CFO, Nicole, like she was setting up people's like email accounts, like in Gmail, like herself. We had G, our head of operations. He's like provisioning all of the Lenovo laptops. And I'm just like, this is so stupid. Like every other part of our business at the time was running off of some new venture-backed software that like made it really easy. We were using Expensify, right? And like when Expensify first came out, I remember Rudd and I were like, "Oh, dude, remember at Banquet at our last company, it's like you would just have a shoebox full of receipts and you'd have to like hand them to an accounting person. And it's like, and now we have software, you take a picture of it. For payroll, I think we were like an early customer of Zenefits, and like we got all of our salespeople up and running on payroll and benefits in an afternoon. At our first company, it was like this hellish thing with like some guy from Paychex. So I'm sitting there with all of these internet cables and hardware and all this crap. And I'm thinking like, okay, so this seems like an area where we could have some improvement with like a modern solution. And so, fortunately, after we sold Swarm to Groupon, and then I got to spend a bunch of time, or a little bit of time, about a year and a half at Groupon, selling SaaS into SMBs. I was fully convinced that not only did the IT solution that I had thought about several years earlier still need to exist, but I was more convinced than ever that actually the one corner of the market where I developed some expertise, SMBs, that was the corner of the market that needed it the most. Like at the time, there were a bunch of companies coming out saying like, we're going to be the next ServiceNow. Well, if you ask anybody who uses ServiceNow, they're like, I don't know, we're fine with this. Like,
yeah, it kind of just does the job. Yeah,
yeah, totally. It's like, yeah, does the world need another one? I don't know, right? Like, so yeah, I think the combination of me really having the conviction as the sort of future customer, feeling the pain, but also knowing the market segment that it was best suited for, put those two things together. Yeah, I came back to New York in 2016, and I was like, God, for the first time in 3 companies, I actually have what I think is a reasonably good idea. I've got reasonably good expertise in this area, and there aren't 15 other people doing it.
That makes sense. One thing that's interesting is, I think you have sometimes this misalignment of go-to-market and products, right? And what you'll have is like this enterprise product that they're trying to sell, bottoms up and get a bunch of people to adopt it. It's like, well, you need multiple stakeholders. And flip side is, when you have something more targeting the SMB, like you want to have just high velocity sort of motion to it, because the ACVs could be smaller than, say, if you were targeting Coca-Cola, for example, right? So how do you solve for that velocity component and match, kind of that go-to-market to the product?
Brute force is a good place to start. Like that's the nice thing about the SMB market. I think one of the reasons why I've always liked it is SMBs, generally speaking, your product it needs to be simple, but what that also means is that you can get an MVP to market that will likely solve enough of the problem, and you can do it in a less complex, less costly, faster way, right? Like if I was trying to build an IT management solution for the SME or enterprise, it potentially would have taken me 18 to 24 months to build something that could have reasonably been stood up in a more enterprise environment. With SMBs, we essentially put together an MVP that was a mix of managed services. I hired a guy from Best Buy to actually just sit behind as like the support person, wrote this kind of wonky little integration to Slack. And then we had these like weekly reports that would get emailed out. And then we stitched together some off the shelf software. But like we stood that up in 6 weeks, and we had our first paying customer, I think, in month 2 after launching the MVP. And so to your point, like the advantage of the SMB, the disadvantage is obviously these are smaller deal sizes, churn's going to be higher, all that. But for getting a product off the ground, the speed at which you can validate, the speed and the lack of complexity really works in your favor. The part that gets challenging, though, is if you don't respect how much of a volume game it is, particularly for first-time founders who maybe haven't done founder-led sales or like don't have a commercial background, your brain will melt when you actually do the math on how many customers you have to talk to just to get your first few $1,000s in revenue to fall out the bottom.
I think that's the big challenge a lot of people I think have with this space in general. But like as the company starts to scale, in the beginning you're brute forcing, right? At any point does like a network effect, like the mom and pop sort of, used to be like the yellow book pages, they look up the ad or something like that. Like at any point does that start to kick in along the journey, or is it like constantly, kind of trying to figure out, hey, what's that next channel to scale?
Look, it should, right? Like if customers love your product, then at some reasonable scale, probably, north of 10 million, then you should start to see a more meaningful percentage of leads coming inbound from existing customer referrals. And like we bought two companies, and like that was one way we could actually help validate how happy their customers were. Like anybody can send you a summary that's like, our NPS is higher than Apple's, which is like basically what everybody says about their product, and it's not true. But when you actually like look at the funnel and you go, oh wow, so like 70% of your new customer acquisition is coming from existing customer referrals. Okay, that tells me a lot about how engaged your customers are and how happy they are. But that takes time. I mean, referrals are not a channel you can depend on for a very long time. And then even once you get bigger, it's very rare that like that's going to be the main driver of things. And so, for us, again, with SMB being a volume play, like for a lot of the founders where I'm an active angel investor, right? And so I've invested in a bunch of companies, and like this is one of those hard conversations I have with like, particularly with first-time founders, is like, okay, if you're having trouble getting some initial traction, it's like, how many emails have you sent? How many meetings did you have last week? And then when I like bust out the spreadsheet and show them like, hey, to get to our first million in ARR at a $10,000 ACV product at Electric, we sent 100,000 emails and made 10,000 phone calls in the first year. And we did it with a team of 6 people out of like a little office in the West Village. People's jaws drop. And it's like, yeah, you want there to be some highly scalable set it and forget it thing. But the reality is like the only way you're going to get there is by doing a whole bunch of things that are really painful at first.
That is that's crazy. That's a lot of meetings. I guess like since we're talking a lot about the stuff you do advise a lot of founders, and thank you for that, by the way. You're very generous with your insights. I guess like what's the major things that you did differently at Electric, since it's the third time around?
I mean, first one out of the gate was the product market fit component, right? Like actually starting a business that was born out of a very clear problem that I had, a very clear problem that I was able to articulate and validate that many other businesses had, and ultimately come up with a solution that was different enough and better than the available options. Like my first two companies, we spent easily 18 months just wandering around in the desert trying to find a home for the thing we built, or vice versa. And I think largely that was because like Rudd and I started those companies for kind of the wrong reasons. Like we started them because we wanted to start companies. We didn't want to work for people. Thankfully it worked out, but it worked out despite the fact that I don't think we had great reasons for starting them. So Electric was the other way around. And like, that's something that I tell even, people that are thinking about starting a company, which is like, forget about raising money. Forget about, building a product. The thing you just want to be maniacally focused on is like, have I identified a really important problem, something that's really painful, and it's in an area where there really isn't a good solution? And if that's true, you're going to skip past a pretty substantial chunk of that really painful kind of like finding product market fit phase. That's not to say that it's going to be super easy and that there aren't going to be things that you're going to need to figure out. But when you know for sure that you're solving an important problem, there's a willingness to pay for it, that's going to make things a lot easier. And so that's with Electric, like I basically skipped 18 months of pain and suffering by only starting the company once I really knew that I was going after something that made a lot of sense. And then the second thing is I really just became way more of a student of both like recruiting and people management. And so when I think about like most of the pain and suffering post product market fit with my first two companies, it largely had to do with the fact that I really didn't know how to hire the right people for the jobs that we needed to get done. And like when you're a small company, one hire is such a disproportionate percentage of the total headcount So having one person that really isn't the right fit is going to cause huge problems, particularly if it's go to market. People are just going to think that the business sucks. Like no one's going to care like, oh, you hired a bad sales manager. It's like, well, no, you just didn't grow last year, so maybe there isn't a market for this. And so that's where those things can be really dangerous. So yeah, and I've obviously made a ton of hiring mistakes at Electric, but this was the first company where I acknowledged like the only way we're going to grow this business post product market fit is if every time we hire somebody, we get better at identifying talent. We have a higher hit rate, and that I gradually become a better manager. Like there comes a point as a founder, you have to graduate from being like the scrappy hustler, and you have to be a like professional operator, and that's like it's a steep learning curve.
On the hiring front, like I have actually two questions I want to ask you. I guess first I would start with at the earliest days, right? When you were, you said 6 people, and you're doing all these calls, right? Like you're trying to meet the customers, so your calendar's booked. You're doing all these different things. I guess like how do you balance the hiring in that scenario where you're building stuff, you're trying to coordinate people, you're reaching out to the market? Like what was that 20% of your time? Was it 10%? Was it just burst loads of like, how did you kind of balance it?
Honestly, this was the initial team, even though it was far from perfect. The way it was structured, the initial team at Electric, I think for the first time in 3 companies, I got that formula right, in the sense that I didn't have any co-founders, right? And I'm not a technical person. And so what I knew was that the biggest value add I was going to have on the business in terms of quickly establishing the initial product market fit, quickly establishing a business model and a coherent product roadmap to follow that, like I needed to stay focused on that. And to do that, I needed to be in front of both new and existing customers as much as possible. And so the first 2 people that I hired were essentially like player coach execs, right? So it was a VP of product and engineering and a VP of revenue. But both of those guys, what they were able to do is the VP of revenue, he knew this was a tiny little company. So he's going in there and setting up the email cadences and all of the outbound emails to tee up the customer demos and like actually like running full cycle sales. I would just get pulled into 1 or 2 demos a day. I'd get copied on some of the follow-up because a lot of this was just he and I figuring out like what exactly does the messaging need to be so that we can take our conversion rate on the emails from something that was abysmal and unworkable to something that worked, or how many calls do we have to make to a prospect to actually get them to get back to us? And like these little things, like they're nuanced, but if you can figure them out in days and weeks, not months, the company is going to move really fast. So hiring someone who could just own 80% of that day to day was critical. And then likewise on the product and engineering front, the guy that I hired to run that, same deal. He was still spending a lot of time actually writing code himself and shipping and talking to customers. But I'd get pulled into the stuff where we needed to get more insight or we needed to make key decisions. And so if I think about what I did in my earlier companies was I kept way too much low leverage work on my plate for too long. And so like at Swarm, like I would spend my days like assembling email lists for like our sales reps to like go after. Like that's a horrible use of time, right? And time is zero sum, right? Like if it's working for you or against you. And so again, yeah, the way that I set this team up worked much better.
So you pretty much like invalidated, countless VC blog posts and podcasts with that statement, because pretty much everyone would say you hire an IC who can do the work, who's going to be scrappy, who's just going to do this. Like you don't think about the coach because you just need them to just crank out work, right? So like, yeah. I mean, talk a little bit more about that. Like why did you think about the coaching aspect that early?
Some of this just might have been the fact that I was so confident that we had the product market fit out of the gate. And separately, because I'd built 2 companies before, I was like, I want my first 2 direct reports to have a reasonable level of maturity, but still be totally willing to get in there and effectively play the role of an IC for as long as is needed until we have a repeatable process. And then they can actually start to build a team under them. So I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. It's definitely difficult, though, to find people that can operate with the speed and the efficacy and just like the work ethic of a really talented IC. Hard to find people that can do that that also have management experience.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the benefits of this not being my first startup and having a decent network of people was that I had some people I could go to and they were like, sure, for you, like I'll sign up for this and I'll basically go 3 steps back in my career for a period of time because this is going to be much bigger.
What's your general hiring thesis when you're launching a new product? Because I imagine you're hiring much more coaches as the company's scaling in terms of, kind of the core businesses. Is it like, hey, when I do a new product, I'll still kind of put a player coach in that thing, or is it not? Is that not the framework you use?
Well, look, for a while, we were not good at launching new products or entering new markets or anything like that. And that was for a multitude of reasons. But at the end of 22, when we were at around 50 million of ARR, what we sort of looked at the model and realized that the way that we want to generate the next 50 million should be in a radically different manner than how we got to the first 50. And really what that meant was our sort of version 1 of our business model was effectively a mix of software and managed services. As time went on, what we found was that the managed service component was giving us none of the benefits of like profitability or customer experience that you would want to get from services, and giving us all of the drawbacks in terms of scalability challenges, margin challenges, all of that. And some of these things just don't become super obvious until you start to get to more meaningful scale. And so having been in this space for a while, what we realized was, hey, there's actually a really compelling opportunity to rewrite the products and the packages as something that's much more kind of unbundled and PLG leaning. From a go-to-market standpoint, we can rewire a lot of this around something that's more partner focused versus this predictable but very expensive direct sales motion. But to do that, I had to take a look around and assess the team and go, okay, who's got the mindset and who's got both the desire and the capability to essentially launch an entirely new business within this existing business. And bonus points if they can also still manage, what quickly became our legacy business, right? And so you and I were talking about this briefly at your conference down in Miami, but I was like, yeah, so we basically decided to stop selling our legacy product, do 2 riffs and let go of 2/3 of the executive team in like a 90-day period. But it was one of those things where these decisions are only as good as the people you have to help you, go carry it out and execute it. And so wouldn't have been that valuable to commit to a new strategy if I didn't have the people on the team to go do it.
Yeah. Let's dive into that a little bit more because first of all, one, hard freaking decision, right? And a lot of founders going through with it. I actually know a founder who just called me up the other day. He's going through this, and I guess like when you're thinking through that and you're going through it, is the first thing you do to go inwards and say, hey, who are the people that are my pillars or whatever that I need to have committed to this vision? And do you talk it through with them of saying, hey, listen, we're about to do some crazy shit, but like, if you guys sign up for this, like we can go do it? Or what's the approach before you can kind of make the decision?
Yeah, like any business as it starts to grow, if as a founder CEO, you're pushing really hard to constantly get to the next phase, whether it's shipping new products, improving whatever it is, I think you start to see really quickly as time goes on, like who are the people who generally accept the challenge? And then who are the people where as time goes on and the challenges change or the scope gets too big, start to respond to those things by coming up with all the reasons why it won't work or why it can't happen. I have no issue with people telling me that I'm crazy or someone coming to me and sort of thoughtfully saying like, hey, like we think this plan won't work or the strategy is bad for these reasons. But anyone who's been a people manager knows that there's that certain mindset that can seep into people where you just kind of know going into it that like the answer is going to be no, and it's not necessarily for a good reason. And that's usually just the byproduct of someone who, for a multitude of reasons, is probably just not the right fit for the next leg of the journey. So fortunately, I had a couple people on my team who were very bought in and very gung-ho about the next leg. And we're also well equipped to continue to lead their functional areas of the business. So my CTO, Yotam, and my chief people officer, Jamie, they've both been working with me for years. And so they're the only two sort of left from the prior leadership team. But that one I didn't even think about for 2 seconds. I mean, it was just one of those things where we said, "Hey, I think the strategy is we go from this to this to this," and very quickly with both of them, it was like, awesome, cool. When do we start?
Well, a lot of times it's easier, and especially boards will say, "Hey," like you said, like people will just be like, "Hey, the go-to-market's not working," and so the founders sometimes make the decision of like, "Okay, well, sales leader gone, marketing leader gone," right? Stuff like that. But nothing gets changed in product or edge. And I guess, how do you go about doing that diagnosis? Like, do we need to change also stuff on the product and engineering side, like things like that? Like, how do you kind of do that versus I feel like go to market always being the scapegoat?
Yeah, and for a variety of reasons, yeah, it's like the sales and marketing, I think, always get the tongue lashing when the business results aren't there. But yeah, no, we took a really hard look at things and just kind of said, geez, at one point our product and engineering team was 100 people. And I'd say we went about 2 years, and I really could not point to any major leap forward in the customer experience or the technical capabilities of the product. And it was embarrassing. And I just said, like, hey, as CEO of the company, is the steward of our investors and their LPs capital, like, this has to change tomorrow. And that's also, where I knew my CTO, when he joined us, he was our VP of engineering, and he just studied the commercial aspects of the business. He really committed himself to understanding sales and marketing, understanding cost of goods sold and gross margin. And, then I'm sure there's a bunch of CEOs listening to this right now going like, oh my God, I wish my head of engineering would care about margins and care about pipeline and all that. But that's ultimately one of the driving factors for when I decided to promote him to CTO. Is I said, all right, cool. Like, you're really able to think about the business like a business person, and kind of the sword that you're wielding to go make things happen is the technology that we're building. And so I was very, very lucky to have someone like that on the team, because then he and I were able to sit down and say, okay, what we're going to do is, we're going to reduce the size of the team. We can always add back, but we really need to prove that we can increase the velocity, we can increase the impact of what we're doing. And once we do that, and we're shipping on time, and we're making big leaps forward, like, there's money in the bank that we can choose to invest more later. And these are really hard decisions. There were some great people on the team who aren't here anymore. But in under a year, we shipped a whole slate of new products, and just it's incredible, the work from him and his team, and truly enabled us to do all the things that we're doing now. But it was pretty scary prior to that, realizing that, like, man, we've been putting a lot of money in the ground over the last couple of years, and like, I cannot stand behind what we have to show for it.
So when that changeover happens, I imagine, like, culturally you take a hit, or I won't say a hit, but it just has to change as well, because there's now people who used to be there, who used to be part of the culture, just left, right? There's decision making is now uncertain in terms of like, well, what decisions can I make in this environment versus not, right? Like, so how do you kind of go about? I don't want to say reset. Maybe it's resetting the culture, or just reestablishing.
Like, 2023 was probably the hardest year culturally in the business, because we had multiple reductions. Now, obviously, all things being equal, you do one big one and it's over. In a world where you're pivoting aspects of the business and you don't necessarily know what the new business, what that looks like and who you need and what the team needs to be, it's not always that clean, right? And so that, I think, that really had an impact on people, because you can't get up in front of the company and go, yeah, this is the last one. Like, I don't know, like, we have a lot of cash in the bank and we're all excited about the new strategy, but you can't ever guarantee forever, unequivocally, that something like that's never going to happen again. And so in a world where, against the backdrop of basically every other growth stage tech company doing multiple rounds of layoffs, right? Like, the picture outside doesn't look good. The picture inside, as positive as you're trying to keep it, is very confusing, particularly for folks that are like middle management and below that just don't have access to the same information we have. In a world where the teams are increasingly remote, people are pretty disconnected no matter how hard you try. Just kind of making people feel heard, like that's really tough when they're just scattered across the country. So yeah, I mean, no two ways around it. Like it was a really tough year, and I think people definitely had a hard time with it. What I would say now is we were able to enter 2024 with all that behind us, having launched a bunch of exciting new products on time, having landed some really, really exciting partnerships with plenty of cash on the balance sheet, full support of our board, and made some phenomenal hires at all levels of the business. So I think people were able to come into 2024 really feeling like, hey, this is cool. Like we've basically done almost all the things that we said we were going to do, relative to a lot of stuff that's still going on in the market. People talk, and like, I think what some of our employees are hearing from their friends at other startups is that you have companies that are basically still doing the same things they were doing 3 years ago. They're just doing it with a lot less money. And like, at least our employees can see like, hey, we're investing in new products. We're entering new markets. We're making moves. And that's probably been the most impactful thing on the culture, because it's not lip service, right? Like you can just see it. Like this is a radically different business than it was 18 months ago. And so I think that's like, for a lot of founders, you kind of got to show it at some point that it's different. So
yeah, with the time we have left, I want to actually cover some of those new products and more so just from the perspective, I mean, you have talked about the just impact of AI in the past. I guess like, what are the use cases that you're envisioning that AI powers for electric customers, and maybe also internally as well, like if you're doing stuff internally too?
Yeah, I mean, the way we think about it from a customer standpoint, for us, coming out of having historically a fairly large services component to what we do, AI is amazing because we're sitting on millions of IT support tickets, more than arguably anybody else has in the SMB segment. We're sitting on all this device data, we're sitting all this stuff, and we have an excruciatingly detailed understanding of all of the manual processes that go into delivering IT management to a business, what it costs, how long it takes. So when you put all those things together, AI is just a great accelerant to eliminating as much manual work in these high value tasks as possible. And so for us, what we get excited about is there's a whole suite of things that we can do that historically, as a small business, you would have to spend a lot of money and have delivered to you via services. Now we think that a huge chunk of like these traditional IT services can be delivered in a fully automated way, which is kind of a full circle moment. Like that was kind of the original vision for the company anyways. What we found was that like ultimately what SMBs wanted was more of kind of pure play vertical SaaS, which was great because that's a slightly easier thing than building a bunch of AI. But with the LLMs, now we're sitting here with 7 years worth of data and all the knowledge that we have. And so, yeah, we think now we're closer than ever to actually being able to deliver on that vision of fully automated IT management.
Are you starting to use it internally as well, or is that still kind of something you're experimenting with?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's still very much like the kind of separating the fact from fiction at this point. Like us, like every other company, like went through a big phase at the top of the year where we consolidated a lot of our vendors. And so like, we went from like 120 different SaaS tools being used internally to, I don't know, probably half of that. But all of the vendors that we kept, and also many of the vendors who we unfortunately had to churn from, everyone's coming to us with like, but we got this new AI thing, right, and like we give it to you for free. And it's like, sweet, I guess, right? So I think by the end of this year, we're going to have a much clearer understanding as to, who of our vendors have injected AI into their products in a way that like meaningfully changes the results or the experience that we get from it. But early innings. Yeah. So yeah, too early to say.
So, RSA was whatever, I don't know, the security conference, it was a few weeks ago. And, a lot of people were talking about shadow IT because I think with AI, they're just saying, hey, like an employee will just, want to randomly use this cool new AI app that they came across and start to play around with it, right? And so I guess like you obviously deal with this a lot. You have a lot of customers that deal with this. Like what are your thoughts on kind of that shadow IT problem? And should customers be worried about it? Like how to approach that issue?
With small businesses, it's less of a factor, but it's still important. Like at the end of the day, if you're going to be downloading software onto your company-owned machine and giving it any sort of access or credentials, that could be a huge problem. And so like that's a huge consideration. I think another thing that people often, particularly those outside of senior management, don't fully appreciate is that many of these tools involve ingesting data that might not be your data to share with them, right? And so we start to think about things like PII. And so any sort of personally identifiable information from your customers' data that they've entrusted to you. And I think that's just going to be a much bigger problem. Like the last thing that you want if you're in a customer facing organization is for one of your customers to find out their data ended up in some random piece of software somewhere. And so I think that's something that people need to be a lot more cognizant of. On the other hand, particularly in SMBs and honestly, even with startups that we talk to, we have a fair amount of startup customers. The vast majority of security breaches are things that are so painfully simple that people often don't talk about it because it's embarrassing, right? Like most SMBs, when they get hacked or they have a data breach, it's because they didn't have multi-factor authentication for their email.
Yeah.
Or you have ports open on your computer or, right? Like really, really basic stuff. And that's one of the reasons why, we wanted to make our products more accessible to more businesses, because virtually every SMB, if you don't have an in-house IT person, there's some existential security breach waiting to happen. And the problem is you don't know what you don't know because you're not an IT expert. And so big focus for us for the remainder of this year is releasing more and more products that you'll be able to get right off our website that can just tell you, hey, either everything's good or like things are not good. And if they're not good, here are some easy steps that you can take with us to go resolve that, because it's a scary world out there. So.
Well, it is indeed, but I think luckily solutions like Electric are out there. And so to wrap things up, I guess, kind of what things would you like to highlight coming up for Electric, whether it's new products or anything like that?
Yeah, again, I would say like if you're a business that has an IT budget, right? So you're buying computers, you're buying software, but you don't have any full-time IT staff or IT professional looking after your stuff. Definitely hit us up, electric.ai, poke around there. We can have one of our experts talk to you. You can sign up for one of our self-sign-up offerings. Hit me up directly, Ryan@electric.ai, if you're a founder and you just want to chat. But yeah, we're pretty easy to find and we're always happy to help.
We're going to link to your Twitter, of course, as well, where Ryan's always tweeting some good thoughts out. So for everyone to follow. But, honestly, thank you so much for answering these. Like I had a whole list of questions that we didn't even get to because there's just so much. But, every single time I talk with you, it's just a bunch of rich insights for founders. So, thank you for sharing so much and for helping the founders the way you do. And excited to see, where you continue to take Electric in the future.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.